Salam, peace be upon you, my friend. My name is Muhammad Laiq Siddiqui, the father of Holophase. We left part 48, standing on the edge of the silent ground, with the deepest thread already tight in our hands. If you remove the permission for distinction, you do not get a strange universe. You get something indistinguishable from nothing. You get a reality that cannot be pointed to, cannot be separated from its negation, cannot be talked about without cheating. And the moment you try to speak about it, you have already reintroduced the very capacity you try to remove. So now we continue. Same voice, same discipline, same firewalled rigor, but we complete the foundation. We seal the undifferentiated phi so thoroughly that the next step, differentiation, will not feel like a leap into mystery. It will feel like the first lawful move in a game whose rules have been verified. Let's begin with the necessity we already touched, and then we tighten it until it becomes a lock. A reality indistinguishable from nothing is not publicly real. That sentence sounds philosophical until you realize it is also the most practical statement imaginable. If no difference can be certified, nothing can be carried from one observer to another. No measurement can be set up. No record can be compared. No experiment can be repeated. No claim can be stabilized. Reality becomes a private word with no public handle. This is why phi is not a decorative hypothesis. It is a minimal permission layer. It is what makes any handle possible. And now comes the next tightening. If phi is the permission for comparability, then a coherent world cannot have two incompatible permission layers running underneath it at the same time. Imagine two rulers, not merely with different units, but with different meanings of same length. Not inches versus centimeters, something deeper. One ruler says two segments are equal if they match by alignment. Another ruler says they are equal if they weigh the same. Another says they are equal if they make the same sound when struck. If there is no higher agreement about what counts as a legitimate comparison, the community cannot even decide whether two people measured the same thing. The world becomes a patchwork of non-translatable certainties. A coherent universe cannot survive that kind of fracture. Because coherent universe already means there exists a stable backbone of equivalence and non-equivalence that lets different descriptions be compared, translated, stitched. You can have multiple coordinate charts, many descriptions, many languages, many gauges, but you cannot have multiple incompatible meanings of comparability itself. So we seal a principle that sounds simple, but is immensely powerful. One coherent world implies one comparability backbone. If you think you have multiple phis, one of two things must be true. Either you are merely relabeling the same underlying permission in different languages, or you have broken coherence and drifted into separate, non-comparable worlds that cannot share public facts. This is not dogma. It is what one world means in operational terms. One shared comparability structure that all public claims in the end reduce to. Now, with that unity sealed, we confront a temptation that always arrives when foundations become clean. The temptation to say, so phi is mathematics. It's understandable. Mathematics is the most successful pattern language we have ever built. When the world becomes readable, mathematics shows up like a faithful translator. But the translator is not the ground. Mathematics is a description language for patterns. Phi is what makes patternhood possible at all. A recipe is not bread. A musical score is not the symphony. A weaving chart is not the carpet. They can be precise, they can be rigorous, they can be unbelievably powerful, but they are maps. Phi is not the map. Phi is the condition that makes any map correspond to anything. This matters because confusing phi with mathematics does a subtle kind of smuggling. It makes it sound like the foundation is already a fully articulated formal structure. But undifferentiated phi is not yet a story, it is permission. It is the can that makes formalism meaningful, not a particular formal object with inner parameters and pre-selected axioms. So we seal the distinction. Mathematics describes the shapes that appear once distinguishability is licensed. Phi is the minimal license that allows shape to be a coherent notion. And then, right after that, another temptation arrives. The temptation to give phi a goal. People love stories. We cannot help it. We want beginnings to aim toward endings. We want foundations to want something. We want the universe to have intent hidden inside its root. But the silent ground cannot carry that without contamination. Purpose requires an inside and an outside, a target and a path, a better and a worse. It requires a distinction between success and failure, between what is intended and what is accidental. It requires a whole scaffold of evaluative structure that does not belong in the undifferentiated permission layer. Phi has no goal. It does not want to become spacetime. It does not aim toward consciousness. It does not desire laws of physics. Purpose will appear later, if it appears at all, as a property of certain complex self-referential patterns that arise inside the differentiated world. Patterns that can model alternatives and compare outcomes. So we seal non-teleology as a firewall against narrative drift. We are not allowed to tell myth stories at the foundation. The foundation is not a character. The foundation is not a will. The foundation is a permission. Now, with unity sealed, with math and purpose properly placed, we return to the deepest reduction question. What happens if you try to reduce phi? You can try, as humans always try. You can say, phi is really information. But information requires distinguishable states, phi again. You can say, phi is really computation. But computation requires distinct symbols, distinct steps, phi again. You can say, phi is really quantum superposition. But superposition is defined relative to basis distinctions and measurement readouts, phi again. You can say, phi is really consciousness. But consciousness is contrasted with unconsciousness, awareness with unawareness, phi again. You can say, phi is really structure. But structure is difference organized, phi again. You can keep trying and you will keep finding the same pattern. Because the act of reduction is itself a comparative act. To reduce A to B, you must distinguish A from B and assert a relation between them. The tool you are using is built out of comparability. So phi is what remains when everything else is removed. Because removal itself presupposes a difference between present and absent. You can strip away objects, laws, fields, metrics, dimensions, substances, purposes, and you can keep stripping. But you cannot strip away the permission for stripping without using it. This is the irreducible core. Not because we are stubborn, but because we have hit the fixed point of reduction. The ladder cannot remove the floor it stands on. And this brings us to the famous question that always waits at the bottom of every foundational staircase. Why something rather than nothing? In most philosophies, this question is treated as a deep abyss. Here we treat it as a diagnostic instrument. The question compares something to nothing. It demands the possibility of distinguishing the two. It is already using phi before it can even be asked. So the question cannot escape the permission layer. It cannot stand outside phi and demand an explanation of phi. This does not mean the question is meaningless. It means the question is self-answering in a very precise way. It reveals that any ultimate why that tries to step behind comparability collapses into one of two outcomes. Either it uses phi and becomes circular in the necessary sense, like using language to describe the condition for language, or it refuses phi and becomes inexpressible, because expression itself depends on distinctions. So we seal this too. The ultimate why cannot get behind the permission of comparison, because behind is already a comparative concept. The universe, at its deepest public foundation, does not begin with an explanation. It begins with what makes explanation possible. Now we tighten the foundation further with a tool that looks negative, but is actually one of the most constructive tools in rigorous thinking: the negative seal. To keep the ground silent, you must say clearly what it is not. Otherwise, the mind will smuggle pictures into it. Phi is not substance, because substance implies amount, location, units, density, comparative structures that belong to later stages. Phi is not energy, because energy is a tally defined inside the measurement framework with units and conservation rules. Phi is not a field in spacetime, because spacetime is not pre-installed here. Phi is not mind, because mind is a differentiated category that presupposes the very comparability it would allegedly explain. Phi is not a law, because laws are regularities of change, and we have not yet licensed change. Phi is not a measurement outcome, because outcomes require comparators, windows, protocols, later operational structure. These negatives are not denials out of fear. They are boundary posts that prevent category mistakes. A clean foundation is not a place where you say everything. It is a place where you refuse to say what cannot yet be earned. At this point, the undifferentiated floor can be held in one breath, not as a list, but as a coherent posture. Phi is the permission for distinction. Existence talk presupposes it. Difference is an expression, not the ground. Only relations can be public. Closure seeds invariance. Global description may require patchwork. Spacetime is emergent. The ground is non-teleological and non-substantial. And the core cannot be reduced without circularity. That is the floor. But now we must do something even more serious, because a floor alone does not build science. Science requires discipline. It requires a way to prevent ourselves from turning the permission layer into poetry. It requires operational seals. This is where epistemic humility becomes not a virtue, but a requirement. We cannot grab phi directly. We cannot hold it like a rock in the hand. We can only indicate it by what it enables and what it forbids. When someone claims, "I have described phi positively," the firewall asks, "Can your description be made operational? Can it be tied to a comparator procedure, to a licensed window, to a reconstructible measurement chain? Or is it only a picture in the mind?" Humility here means do not pretend you have more access than you have. If you cannot certify a claim publicly, call it private. If you cannot define the scope, call it incomplete. If you cannot carry it through a stable encoding, call it poetry. Poetry has value, but it is not public science. This humility seal becomes the voice discipline for everything ahead. We point at the ground. We do not pick it up. Now comes the first hard operational hinge, the window. A public fact exists only inside the declared finite window. This is one of the sharpest statements in the whole architecture because it prevents the most common form of scientific cheating, the claim with no boundary. If you say, this is true everywhere, always, but you cannot specify under what conditions it was measured, what instruments, what protocols, what noise model, what scope, then you have not made the scientific claim. You have made the proclamation. A window can be spatial, temporal, logical, procedural, anything that defines the domain where a claim is certified. But it must be declared, because without it, replication is impossible. Another observer cannot reconstruct what you did if you cannot say where and when and how your claim lives. So we seal the rule. No window, no public truth. And now the second operational hinge, coherence licensing. Even with a window, not everything is readable. Some windows are noise. Some windows are below detectability. Some windows do not carry stable structure that can be distinguished from random fluctuation. So we introduce a threshold. Below a certain coherence level, the world is operationally silent. Above it, patterns become licensable. This is not defeatism, it is honesty. It is the recognition that public science is not a right, it is an achievement. A pattern must rise above the fog enough that different observers, using shared procedures, can converge. This coherence threshold is one of the reasons science progresses in steps. It is why some questions become answerable only after instrumentation improves. But deeper than technology, it is also a structural fact. If you cannot exceed coherence, you cannot certify. Now we install the finite access principle. Phi has infinite depth, but public statements are finite. This is the end of fantasies about total description. It is the end of the dream that a finite being can speak infinite reality in one breath. Public knowledge is finite because procedures are finite, and encodings are finite, and communities are finite. So every certified claim must be a finite slice of an infinite potential. The goal is not omniscience. The goal is reliability. And now, with finite access admitted, we install the estimation discipline requirement. No error bars, no science. This is where the firewall becomes brutally concrete. If you cannot say how uncertain you are, if you cannot model your noise, if you cannot specify your scope, if you cannot give a replication protocol, then your claim has no certificate. It floats as interpretation. Uncertainty here is not weakness. It is the price of honesty. It is what makes claims comparable. It is what allows two observers to disagree intelligently rather than fight narratively. Then comes the finite jet sufficiency principle, which is the bridge between infinite depth and finite observables. Public observables depend on finite derivatives only. Infinite jets remain latent potential, not operational content. This saves science from drowning in the ocean of mathematical possibility. It says, the map is finite, and that is not a failure. It is the only way a map can be shared. Now we arrive at the core of public knowledge, the public comparator axiom. Science is what survives reconstruction. A statement is scientific only if others can reconstruct it through shared comparator procedures. Procedures that are repeatable and gauge invariant. This axiom turns private seeing into public knowing. It converts I observed into we can test. It makes science a social technology of disciplined comparison rather than a collection of personal revelations. Then comes extensionality, encoder-complete equivalence. If two models produce identical license outputs across all license windows, they are empirically identical. No observational difference means no scientific difference. This is a crucial firewall against metaphysical surplus. It does not say the universe has no hidden depths. It says hidden depths that make no difference to any licensed measurement cannot be claimed as scientific distinctions. They may be private metaphysics, they may be poetry, but they cannot be operationally certified as different worlds. Now we install parsimony, not as aesthetic minimalism, but as firewall engineering. Before dynamics, admit only the minimal structure required for licensing. Extra primitives are smuggling. If you add unnecessary structure, you increase narrative freedom while decreasing falsifiability. You make it easier to explain anything, which means you have explained nothing. Parsimony is the discipline that keeps the silent ground silent until the world itself forces more structure upon you. Then we seal no units and no scales. Undifferentiated phi contains no meters, seconds, joules. No intrinsic ruler is baked into the ground. Units arrive later through calibration, through stable cycles, through comparators, through emergent standards inside differentiated structure. This is one of the most subtle anti-smuggling moves, because units feel obvious to humans. We live inside units. But the foundation cannot begin with what must later be derived. Now we return, with greater clarity, to topology, closure. The minimal, non-trivial, compact structure forces cyclicity. Closure forces integers. Quantization traces to topological invariance. This ties back to the earlier loop, but now it is anchored operationally. Closure is not mere geometry. It is what produces stable invariants that survive gate shifts and patch stitching. It is how a universe can generate whole number facts that do not wash away under noise or redescription. Then we seal pure capacity, zero internal parameters. Undifferentiated phi has no knobs, no hidden constants, no private dials. Any constant of nature arrives only with instantiation, dynamics, and calibration. This prevents a common cheat, pretending the definition of the ground contains numerical facts that actually had to be imported. Now we reopen the door to a strange but crucial possibility: self-applicability. Phi can, in principle, apply to itself. Distinction capacity can distinguish its own acts of distinction. This is the seed of self-reference, reflection, model making, and observer-like structure. Not because we added mind as a primitive, but because the permission structure allows recursion. If a system can make distinctions, it can, under sufficient richness, make distinctions about its own distinction making. This is how meaning and agency can later appear without being smuggled into the ground as teleology. They emerge as permitted patterns, not as foundational intentions. Now we seal metaphysical necessity again, but in its strongest form. Any attempt to escape phi uses phi. Even to propose a deeper primitive, you must distinguish deeper from not deeper, primitive from derived, foundation from superstructure. You are already using the capacity you claim to get behind. So phi is unavoidable, not by decree, by the logic of what it means to propose anything coherently. From there, exhaustiveness becomes natural. Any deeper ground either reintroduces phi or becomes operationally meaningless. There is no third option if you demand public science. Then, irreducibility tightens the lock. Reducing phi uses phi or becomes inexpressible. Phi is really X, either translates back into phi language or fails operationally. And now, we arrive at the final moment of the undifferentiated section, completeness. This is the backpack verification. Before we allow differentiation, before we allow the first move that will give us time-like, space-like, law-like structure, we verify that the undifferentiated framework contains every prerequisite for a readable universe. Not every imaginable phenomenon, not every poetic dream, every prerequisite for readability, comparability, relational invariance, public carriers, closure invariance, patchwork stitching, window licensing, coherence thresholds, finite access, estimation discipline, finite observables, reconstructible comparators, parsimony, no smuggled units, no hidden parameters, and the permission for self-reference. The claim here is simple and enormous. We will not need to add a new primitive mid-cosmogenesis. We will not be forced to say, oh wait, we forgot X. If that happens, our foundation was not sealed. It was guesswork. But our aim has been engineering, not improvisation. So we end the undifferentiated stage with a carry that is not a slogan, but a certification stamp. The backpack is verified, not guessed. And now, after all this, notice what we have accomplished. We have a foundation that does not begin with matter, energy, space, time, or mind. Yet, it can ground all of them as emergent readings once differentiation begins. We have a foundation that refuses absolutes and yet produces public invariants. We have a foundation that admits infinite depth and yet yields finite certified statements. We have a foundation that blocks metaphysical overreach without denying the universe's richness. We have a foundation that makes science not a mythology, but a discipline of reconstruction. We have a foundation that carries an ethics, not as politics, but as the necessary consequence of public truth. If you claim publicly, you must allow comparison publicly. This is the completed picture of undifferentiated phi. It is the silent ground, not an object, not a process, not a substance, not a law, not a purpose. Yet the permission that makes all of those concepts meaningful, testable, and shareable once the world begins to differentiate. So now the stage is set for the next act, which is not a new foundation, but the first readable change. Up to here, we have been building the loom, verifying the threads, defining what counts as a knot, installing the rules that prevent cheating, and checking that the pattern can be woven without importing foreign cloth. Next, we will finally weave. And when differentiation arrives, it will not arrive as myth. It will arrive as the first lawful consequence of a ground that has been sealed, disciplined, and verified. And as always, the formal mathematical works behind these concepts can be found on Zenodo by searching for Holophase. Salam and peace be upon you.